But of course, it's a concept that goes back again to the 19th century, where there were really starts of popularization. Scientists and popularizers were selling hundreds of thousands of copies of the books. But if I had to choose one today, I would choose science culture. And why I say this? Because I think we're all used to this idea of scientific culture, which comes probably from a rather superficial reading of the famous lecture by C.P. Snow on science culture. So this idea that while having a humanistic culture or a certain sense for the arts is regarded as something socially necessary in many cultures, science culture is, or scientific culture is not something we can take for granted. So we should inject in the population, in the general public, doses of scientific culture and increase. In this meaning, it's a rather quantitative concept for me. But if I look, for example, at the data, for example, in our group and with Observer, we've been running for more than 10 years a monitoring of public perception of science in Italy and also looking at international studies. I would say that the real problem is not the lack of a scientific culture in that sense, but the real problem is the fragility of a culture of science and technology in society. And what I mean is, of course, it's important to know things and facts, but of course we all know that the problem, one of the problems in our society is actually the overload of information and how to make sense of the information. But the real challenge in many ways is to have a culture of science in society, which means a culture open to the new things science and technology is proposing, but at the same time critical. And when we say, so this meaning is probably more close to what scholars in France have called a mise en culture, la culture scientifique, which is not science culture as a set of information and a set of knowledge, but as a certain way of making sense of science. And of course, to have science as part of the culture in this sense, avoiding the opposite shortcuts of just rejecting science or just embracing whatever science proposes, of course has a price to pay, which is, for example, the critical element, the criticism. When we deal with culture, we feel a certain possibility. If we're talking, for example, about a painting or a book or some food, we are normally in a position to be able to criticize. But when it comes to science as part of the culture, this is not possible. So what I think we should reflect also on the basis of empirical evidence, because, for example, if we look at data on optimism regarding new technologies, for example, in the field of biomedicine or new possibilities offered by science, in many countries we see this ambivalence, a very pragmatical, I would say almost opportunistic expectation, and on the other side, of course, a concern. And this concern we find mostly in people with low education. And what does it mean for scholars like me? This means that the people who are better educated, they are less afraid of the new things of science offered by science and technology because they feel prepared to cope with the implications, with the unexpected consequences. So this is what I have in mind. Science culture, of course, it's a very broad concept that it would be nice to discuss with you. But now I think we should collect the cards. Unless Susanna and Christian and Brian have comments.
Well, I'll give you the results. I'll give you the results of the opinion poll we've just done in a second. But just to make sure everybody understood, Massimiliano used the phrase there in French, la mise en culture. Are you familiar with this phrase? Yeah. It was actually used by somebody, Lévy Leblanc, writing in the mid-1990s. And I had the experience of speaking in France about 6 months ago, giving a talk about, actually, I called it, Y a-t-il une science de la communication scientifique? Y a-t-il, is there a science of science communication? But in that context, I used the phrase mise en culture as a challenge for science communication studies. And I was quite shocked when somebody who's very well established in the field, both actually in policy and practice as well as in research, said, "Oh, la mise en culture, it's done. We've achieved it." And I think that's another interesting nuance, because I think what he meant was that in France, indeed, the concept of la culture scientifique, technique et industrielle, CSTI, is well established. So in that sense, la mise en culture has happened because it's part of policy. I think when you're talking about it, and when I think Lévy Leblanc was talking about it, was that science would be as everyday as cornflakes, as everyday as cappuccino, as accessible and as not necessarily dumbed down or trivialized, but as easy to have an engagement with, perhaps I should say, as going to the cinema or going to the theatre, and indeed subject to the same kind of critique. So it's interesting that
literally means
the putting into culture. And it's a play on the phrase which you may know if you've worked in theatre or read plays, la mise en scène, the putting onto stage. Okay, but it's very much his phrase, and it stayed his phrase.
But regarding what you were saying, that it's done in France, I would disagree with that, because as such, la mise en culture, the science culture, as I try to describe it, is never accomplished. It's inevitably an ongoing process. I mean, Thomas Kuhn has demonstrated that the culture within science itself is changing historically. So that there are styles of thinking, that there are ways of thinking that are appropriate in certain periods and not in others. So this is a typical attribute of culture.
Well, we just engage here with our small public, public singular, by the way. Nobody picked publics. Nobody picked popularization. Nobody picked deficit, as I said. Scientific culture, the green card, how many have we got of those? 1, 2, 3, 4. It's near the top. Visible scientists, I don't think was anybody. 1. Expertise was picked by 3 or 4. Is that right? Yeah. And engagement was picked by 3 or 4. And surprisingly, I think nobody picked participation. Now, I don't know. One. Actually, the very first person. Okay. Dialogue. Okay. Can I say something about engagement? Because as I handed the card for engagement to Suzette there, she said the word that means everything and nothing. And it really is a problem that it has come to be this all-inclusive, all-embracing, and therefore very ambiguous and confused term. It has become the term in Britain to refer to a range of activities that is very diverse. It refers to the actions of scientists who go to shopping centers to explain, why the bubble attaches to things or whatever, okay? That's public engagement. It refers to a range of policy initiatives. It refers to basically all kinds of interactions that could come under science communication or public participation. And as a consequence, I think it is rapidly losing its value. Just as many other things lose their value by overuse and by overextension. And I think the exercise that we engaged in here, which will appear in the first chapter of the new PCST handbook, was intended to contribute, if we could, some clarification of the ambiguities on the one hand, but also the value that there attaches to these words. And engagement, unfortunately, has become one of those that is losing its currency.
I don't want to get you off your train, but I do just want to add a couple of examples of just how loose the use of the term engagement has become. And two situations or encounters I had recently one was with a student at the University of Washington, a graduate student, a really, really smart person, who came in to talk to me about engagement. She'd read all this stuff about engagement. To her, engagement meant science writing, believe it or not, because she was actually from a writing. It's not a good acoustics. She came in to talk to me about engagement, and she'd read things about engagement, but she took it to mean writing and only writing. It was really, really interesting. And then someone that I had correspondence with in regard to the journal actually was trying to imply the term engagement to public relations press releases. Okay, so, and I said, well, you know, we had this conversation, but it's not really what most of us mean by that, but it's just an example of, speaking of expertise, people bring their own expectations, and it's like sustainability that we talked about in the plenary. It's such a general term. People bring their own notions of what engagement should be. With engagement, there is such a thing as engaging writing that encourages people to be engaged, absolutely. But it's not limited to that, and it's not what we usually talk about in our own interpretive community as engagement. So just I wanted to add those examples.
Well, I'm going to extend the confusion further, not engaged in French, meaning it's politically committed, generally speaking, to the left. So, you know, l'écrivain engagé is something quite specific, and Sartre and that generation of activists and philosophers were engaged in an intellectual activity that was engagé.
Christian, do you want to comment on the choices? Yeah, shall we? I think you had a question or a comment.
I speak too much, I think. No, I presented a work I did on my own, and I read Le Blonde, and I never heard about him here. It's the first time. But what I read about him, a paper, it was quite old paper, is what putting culture into science, but not science in culture. So the other way around, and I think it's great. I mean, I would like you to, I don't know if you know that thesis or that idea. I think is the scientists themselves feel like they are in the ivory tower, and they reproduce that fact, the fact that they are apart from society. So if they saw themselves as normal, ordinary people, and really go and work with other cultural aspects, maybe we could start with that to change the science culture.
Yeah, of course. When I said a culture of science in society, this includes also scientists, coming to terms with culture and society, which of course it's also
obvious. When
no, it's very.
I think we should emphasize the other way of saying instead of putting science.
Yes, but it's not obvious today, because we have socially invented a separation between science and culture,
Yes.
which is the result, of several historical and political processes. But in the past, there was not an issue, science culture. If you look at
Yes.
scientists like Galileo
Yes,
or
of
Newton,
course.
they were, or Darwin, I mean, they were in fully part of the culture of their time. Galileo was trained as a drawer in the first training he received, and this helped him understand his observation of the moon, that because he knew chiaroscuro, and nobody of his colleagues could understand. His father was a musician, and he used his musical skills to measure time when he was doing his experiment, because he didn't have a precise way of measuring time. He's in experiments of sliding objects. So this is what I mean. But of course, we created this
But if
separate.
we could promote putting culture into science in the wider sense, to see yourself as a human and not just as a scientist and all that, I think it's...
Chiara,
Okay.
if you can introduce, sorry.
Okay,
just-
so I'm Chiara Ceci and I work at the Royal Society of Chemistry in the UK. So as we were mentioning famous scientists, I'll take my minority, just one vote, for leading the conversation to the visible scientists, because I think that's important. It's not something new. I mean, again, if we think about the history of chemistry, for example, you know, Humphrey Davy was so popular, and you know, streets in London had to be made one way because his lecture was so popular. So for me, actually, it's interesting because the new edition of the handbook now went to the cover. You have people, and before you had a visible scientist. So you had
chapter on scientific celebrities.
Okay.
A new one. Sorry.
Yes. The reason why I chose it is because sometimes when I work, when I talk about what we can try to do, what we are trying to achieve, I question my colleagues' idea of what's the public. But most of the time they say, oh, I've been saying this for years, we need the Brian Cox for chemistry. So Brian Cox, if for those who don't know, is a science celebrity, he's a physicist, and he's on telly every other minute, and it's done biology now. He's a celebrity. So some scientists in my community, we need the same thing. That's gonna solve everything. The point in this, I'd love to hear from you about this. Thank you.
I think we have something to listening to people. There was, and I'm struggling to remember who wrote this, but there was actually a decade or so called The Visible Scientist, or Visible Scientist, is remember? Ray Goodall. Yeah. Okay. It's been, time flies. It's been longer than I thought. As I recall that book, she was not just talking